This is lesson number 5, the third video, the last one for this lesson. And yes, we're looking at the entire 7th chapter, 60 verses. This is a really great chapter. And this is a chapter that I'd really recommend that you would read over and over and over again because it is a phenomenal synopsis of Israel. Excuse me. And what we see in the Old Testament and just the flow of things. Very useful like that. And it reads as a historical guide to what happened to the people of Israel. So Stephen is speaking before the council, and they were very concerned about the temple of Moses. In other words, these false accusations. They didn't know whether they were false or not. And the high priest had asked him, hey, are these things true? And Stephen's responding. And so they wanted to know about the temple and Moses and what he said about God and the law. When you think about it, Stephen went much further back. He went back to Abraham. He went back to the beginning of the Jewish people. He went back to when God called Abraham out of the land of Chaldees. And the idea behind this, I believe, is that he was telling them, you know, you're questioning me about the temple. You're questioning me about Moses. But I believe all the way back to the beginning, long before we had a temple, long before we had the law, we were a people of faith. That's what he's reminding them of. And so he tells them from the very beginning, he goes through all the details. Again, I would encourage you to read. I can't go through it all right now because of the format. Okay, but read it, just pay attention. The bottom line is that Abraham obeyed God. And in Genesis, it tells us that he believed God, and God reckoned it unto him as righteousness. And he gave him a sign of covenant. And that sign of the covenant was circumcision. And you know, sometimes people think, well, that's a rather strange sign of the covenant, isn't it? Well, there's a lot of elements involved for that thing. A lot of elements involved. It has been a sign that's been used against the Jewish people. Hitler did that. He would come into towns, say, who's Jewish? Nobody'd volunteer. And then he'd say, drop your drawers. And they'd find out immediately who was Jewish. In this situation right here, what we're finding is it's a removal of the flesh. And it's the picture of how we are to walk before the Most High God. Not in fleshliness, dead to the flesh. Also, God had promised Abraham progeny. He'd promised him descendants. He'd promised him offspring. He'd also promised him land. But to gain the land and to have the population, you know, he'd need the offspring, right? And he'd promised him that. And what it's a picture of is the removal of the flesh at the closest point of paternity, at the very point where the seed and the egg come together type of thing. So there's that picture of it. Then there's also pictures of literally the shape of a circumcision is in a circle. It's much like a rainbow. When we look at a rainbow, which is the sign from the covenant with Noah, we see a rainbow as an arch like this, which is really half a circle. If you see a rainbow from above, if you've ever flown in a plane and looked down and seen a rainbow from above like that, it's in a circle. So from God's perspective, that covenant sign of a rainbow is a circle. We see, but in a mirror dimly. So anyway, Abraham was granted the covenant of circumcision. Stephen goes through the balance of the history of the people of Israel. He talks about Joseph. He talks about Abraham's offspring in Egypt, how they multiplied. And then he speaks a lot about Moses because he had been accused about Moses. And he talks about how Moses was raised one way and he realized he was going to be deliverer of the people. And he thought the people understood this. But Moses tried to deliver the people in the flesh. Remember when he killed a guy? And so he wound up fleeing from there and he spent 40 years in the deserts in Midian. Then he comes back to lead the people out. Then he spends 40 years with the people in the desert. Why 40 years? Well, because they didn't enter into the promised land. Why did they not enter into the promised land? They could have made the journey 3-4 weeks, something like that. Why did they not do it? Well, it's because they believed the majority of the committee report. It was a 10-2 against it, and they believed that. Well, why 40 years? That group that had gone out to spy the land was up on the land for 40 days. So for every day they were up on the land, it cost them a year in the fact that they didn't believe in the people had to be in the desert. So Stephen continues to address all these accusations against Moses, the law, the temple, and God. He gets to the end of the history lesson. He goes through everything. And by then, particularly the Sadducees would have known what he was talking about, where he was leading. He looks at them. He says, you are as your fathers. You're obstinate. You're stiff-necked. You're murderers. You received the law, and yet you did not keep it. And boy, there's some vivid warnings for us because you can believe and yet not believe unto salvation. They received the law, yet they didn't keep it. Well, they were cut to the quick. We've seen that phrase 2 or 3 times already. In Acts 2, we saw it, and the people were cut to the quick and said, what must we do to be saved? Here they cut to the quick, and they're going to kill him. And they desired to kill him. And while all the hubbub was happening, Stephen looks up. and he sees Father God in heaven on his throne, and he sees the Son standing next to him. And Stephen voices this. He says, I see this even now. Well, that was blasphemy in their ears, and that was enough. So they decided to kill him, and they did. And you see a lot of parallels in the way that he was killed because of the word, because of what he says to them, receive my spirit, what he says to the Father, don't condemn them for what they're doing. And then right at the end of the passage there, we're introduced to Saul. We'll see a lot more of Saul as we go along. Hey, thank you for your faithfulness. Keep pressing on. I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.